Hey all, here at OS Reviews, you're watching our official review of the Oukitel K10. This is a 6-inch phablet that has a unique 11,000 milliamp hour capacity battery. As such, it's the largest capacity smartphone currently in the world. Now, the K10 is actually the newest version out of this monstrous battery line of smartphones by Oukitel, and the previous iterations included the K10000 and the K10000 Plus. Both of those had a more traditional form factor, since the K10 now has the newer 2x1, which is that stretched aspect ratio popularized by the Galaxy S8 and the LG G6. So it's slightly easier to hold using one hand despite the really large 6-inch display. In terms of specs, the K10 is also pretty good for a mid-tier handset. That includes a Plus display, so it technically is above 1080p. In addition, it features an octa-core chipset by MediaTek coupled with 6 gigs of RAM along with 64 gigs of built-in storage, expandable via micro SD card, and there's Wi-Fi, GPS, and NFC, which is a feature we don't tend to see on many Chinese phones. That means you can actually use this for mobile payment, such as with Google Wallet. So all these features are actually built into a phone with the battery capacity that's roughly 4 times as large as an Apple iPhone. That translates to a little under 30 hours of screen-on time, and you can use it for an entire week before you need to recharge it in practical conditions. So again, this is incredible. It's almost a throwback to the days of old Nokia phones, or dumb phones as we call them, which lasted forever before we needed to recharge them. Going back to something like this really made me nostalgic about older devices like that. And compared to a lot of flagships these days, which can only go for a single day before you need to recharge it, this one really has an amazing battery performance. But does it come at any costs? Well, let's find out in this video. So first, let's take a quick look at the design of the K10. In terms of, again, overall form factor, it really does have a pretty modern overall look. However, it has these really sharp corners and edges, just like the K10000 that came before it. Oukitel is very clever here. They knew that with a larger battery, it's going to be a little bit chunkier than your average phone. So instead of stylizing it as a regular Samsung or LG-esque phone, they're going for a very rugged utilitarian look that reminds you a lot of, let's say, a Kyocera handset or a luxury phone produced by, let's say, Vertu. As a whole, it still feels very premium in the hand because it has a lot of soft touch rubber accents that makes it easy to grip, and there's even a fake leather material on the back, which also again adds to the premium look on paper. Some of these brandings and the edges here are also chamfered out of aluminum, so everywhere that you're holding onto feels incredibly sturdy, like the phone can physically be used almost as a weapon just because of that added bulk and design. On the back, there is a biometric fingerprint scanner along with 2 cameras. Unfortunately, one camera, just like most Chinese phones, is fake, so you don't really get a convincing bokeh blur, but it does have a 21 megapixel sensor on the primary one that actually gets surprisingly good results, as we'll discuss later. There's also a 2-tone LED flash. We also have USB Type-C, which is used for fast charging. Now, to charge this phone up, it takes under 3.5 hours in my testing, so actually not that bad considering how large this battery pack is. Another thing that's really funny about this is it includes this OTG cable, which not only can you use for connecting thumb drives and keyboards and mouse to use this as a little computer, but you can also use it as a power bank. So you can plug this in and then plug this into another phone. All of a sudden you can use your K10 as a power bank for your friends, for your tablet, or for your computer, which is pretty ridiculous. It also has the volume rocker, the power switch, and unfortunately there is no standard 3.5mm headphone jack, so you do have to use an adapter to plug in your standard headphones, which is one con. The front here does have an 8 megapixel camera for selfies and another camera to have that quote bokeh blur, but again, the secondary camera doesn't work very well in terms of the software. There's also an LED flash for your selfies, which does work surprisingly well. Now, although the phone definitely is a little bit chunky, it's really not that bad if you compare it to a device that has a thick rubber case attached, such as this iPhone Plus that has this wallet case, and it becomes even thicker than the Oukitel K10. So in this regard, really it is not that big of a sacrifice as you would expect. It still fits easily into most pockets and into backpacks. And again, with that massive battery, it really is a huge convenience. So if we take a quick look at the software side of things, it has been, for the most part, left as a vanilla build of Android Android, which is nice to see. The fingerprint scanner is pretty quick, and for the most part it's accurate, but you do have to wait for a split second before it scans your finger completely. Definitely not the fastest, but overall it does work, and you can register up to 10 fingers. Afterwards, we have a pretty stock install of, again, Android 7.0 Nougat, including virtual keys on the bottom that you can also hide if you don't want to use them, and you have gestures for swiping up to access things like the full app drawer, and you can also, again, long hold onto the home key here to access Google Assistant, things like that. The long hold on the apps drawer, we can then tap on another app like a browser tab, and because of this really stretched 6-inch display, it actually works really well for, let's say, watching a video while you're replying to a text message or browsing the web, and you can see that the processor is actually doing a good job of keeping up with all these things at once without any problems. You can also resize the pages depending on your preferences and get rid of one altogether. 6 gigs of RAM is also definitely enough to power even the most demanding of users when it comes to lots of tabs being open, lots of programs running, just because you really can't go wrong. 6 gig is the maximum configuration on the market, even for flagships, so that is plenty, and it's more than even on many lower end computers and laptops, which is pretty ridiculous if you think about it, but it ensures that you can open up tons and tons of tabs and still be able to smoothly go back and forth. Bezel sizes aren't that bad. On the front, it really is similar in many ways to this current crop of phones, including the Xiaomi Redmi 5X, when you look at overall dimensions from the top down. It also has pretty cool rounded corners on the edges of the display, so if you look very carefully, all of the corners are rounded. It doesn't really do anything but to add a aesthetic touch, but it does show some good attention to detail. In terms of apps, you have access to all the standard Google utilities built right on in, including the Play Store, Maps, Gmail, YouTube, and Play services, and there's also access to a few additions such as a sound recorder and a file manager, as well as the interesting pedometer app that Oukitel built in. It's using the accelerometer to detect your motion, and it actually works okay. So if you don't have, let's say, a fitness tracker, you can simply turn this on, leave it in your pocket, and it will estimate how many steps you've walked throughout your day. It also kind of makes sense considering they're going for a rugged look, so a lot of rugged phones will have things like thermometers or compass or, again, a pedometer for fitness, so it's one of those extras that they built on in. All the other things, though, including FM radio, gallery, are pretty much the stock versions of their apps that you'll find on a clean install of Android 7.0, so that's definitely nice to see here. The direct notification drawer does have a few tweaks compared to regular Android 7.0. So this mainly includes an eye protection mode that turns on this yellowish filter on the screen. It basically turns off blue light, since blue light is harmful for your eyes at night, and it prevents your brain from really falling asleep quite as easily, so it's a nice built-in mode. There's also the addition of, over here, a QR code scanner. You can tap on that, it will instantly launch into the camera, and you can scan a code. It will start to look up items on Amazon and through the web. There's also a nifty screen recording function that you can access, and a flashlight, which is quite easy to access. The fingerprint scanner can also be programmed in the settings to do other tasks. You can use it to control gestures. I have it set so a simple tap goes back and a long tap takes you back home. So there's also haptic feedback on this phone, so it will vibrate whenever you tap on one of these keys to give you the sensation as if you are tapping on something real. So that actually works surprisingly well. It's a pretty clever implementation. Alright, so let's take a quick look at the camera next. Interface-wise, the K10 is heavily inspired by the iPhone, as you can see by the shutter keys and by the ways that you can navigate between these menus, but overall it's still pretty fast and you have lots of settings to play around with. You can tap on these three dots on the top to access HDR mode, and in this particular phone it actually makes a pretty big difference in landscape shots. It can pull in a lot more color, especially in darker environments. If you hold still, it does a pretty good job of improving the image quality. The blur mode is basically that bokeh, but the problem is it just makes a circle, and everything outside of the circle is out of focus regardless of the real shape of the person or object, so it's a little disappointing. There is a mono mode, a panorama mode, and a pro mode that you can use to change things like ISO, adjust the brightness, saturation, things like that, and again it goes up to 21 megapixels, which is plenty of pixels to really zoom in and crop into your objects. So here is that bokeh image that we captured. You can really tell it's just a circle because even the edges of the box, which I was tapping on to focus, are clearly not in focus because it's outside of this particular circle. With that being said, it still is more than respectable as a camera. As you can see here, this was actually captured at night. I only had one light on in the room, and it still captured a surprising amount of detail after you get past the initial disappointment of the secondary camera. Now, unfortunately, video recording can only go up to 1080p. It doesn't have 4K capabilities. And it's a little disappointing considering the last generation model also had only 1080p, so this is an area that hasn't changed. Still, video footage actually is surprisingly decent. I would say that there isn't any optical image stabilization, but there is EIS that assists you a little bit, and the focusing actually is fairly stable. So you can tap on an object and it doesn't consistently blink in and out of focus. It actually stays in focus for the most of the video. So if you're capturing, landscape shots, it actually does a decent, respectable job. When it comes to call quality, which is still the most important tenet of any smartphone, the K10 also really doesn't disappoint. It has support for 4G LTE bands in certain countries. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get that completely working with AT&T. With that being said, reception quality was still quite strong. I consistently got roughly 3 bars here in the Seattle region, and the microphone was loud and clean sounding according to my test callers. Also because the mic is very close to your mouth because the phone is very stretched. So sound quality here seems to be pretty respectable. All right, so moving on to the web browsing experience next, we're going to use Chrome, which is nice that it's built right on in. It's a good opportunity to take a look at the keyboard, which is just the standard version built onto Android Nougat. It also supports swipe. Tapping go, let's see how long it takes to load the New York Times, and this is the full desktop site. This is a complex page that's filled with lots of challenging ads as well as videos and moving elements, but you can just really tell how quickly it's loaded everything up. You still see some very occasional skip frames as the browser is loading, but you can really tell how overall the processor handles this without any problems at all. Text automatically reflows when you zoom in, and the HD Plus display is a joy to use when it comes to viewing back media content such as photos and videos, and you really get a sense of that as you are browsing along pages like this. The takeaway from the speaker quality is it's actually pretty decent. It gets very loud, especially on maximum volume. It fills up rooms and smaller spaces without any problems. However, it is mounted on the side as opposed to being on the front, and you can occasionally cover it up using your thumb if you're not too careful. It is a mono speaker as opposed to stereo, as you heard there, but at least it's not on the back, which would have been, the worst placement since it gets covered up even more easily. But it doesn't have the richest bass as expected since it's a smartphone speaker, but for watching back quick clips on YouTube, for some quick songs that you may want to share with family and friends, it actually does a good job. And you can always use Bluetooth if you want to connect it to a more impressive speaker. So that's also the overall media experience on the device. You can see that you can stretch to fit the screen in, even if the original has these infamous black borders that you will also see on devices like the iPhone X, for instance, since not all content has been optimized to match the new 18:9 aspect ratio yet. But zoomed in to fill, you get a very generous experience, although sometimes subtitles on the bottom row might disappear if you're watching, let's say, a TV show and you've zoomed in. Still, it works very well on this YouTube app, and enjoying media content is a blast, just because it feels like you're holding onto content. It feels like you're watching in a mini movie theater because of this ultra-wide aspect ratio. In phone settings, we can add a credit card to have access to Google Wallet for mobile payment. There's also some gestures that they built on in if you want to use them. So you can, let's say, unlock the phone by drawing up a shape, or let's say double tapping. Things like that can wake the screen, slide up to unlock, slide down to open the camera, things like that. So it gives you quite a few options if you want to play around with them. Under display, you'll also find something that's called Mirror Vision. This is a technology built in collaboration with MediaTek that smoothes and optimizes videos. So if you have original content that's kind of jerky, you can use this, and it you turn this function on and it kind of makes the entire video feel smoother, like it has faster frame rates. It drains the battery a little bit faster, but it actually works quite well. There's also an ambient light sensor for automatically dimming the screen accordingly. In addition, there is an LED light on this unit, so it will flash when the battery is low, when you have a new event, which is one of the upgrades compared to the previous K10 Plus, which did not have a notification light. So I tested it out with a number of different games, some of them demanding less of the GPU, some of them again requiring some more work just because they're 3D titles such as Asphalt 8, and it all handled it without too many problems. When you're loading the games, it may take a split second longer than on the, again, comparable Snapdragon flagship, and sometimes you will have occasional drop frames as you are loading up titles, again, like Asphalt 8, but it's not crippling at all, and for the most part, the gameplay experience is smooth, it's fluid, and it's fairly responsive. Even if you use it for an entire day without sleeping or eating, the phone is still not going to die. So that is, again, incredible battery life. It's insane. So that's the Oukitel K10. Surprisingly, I like this phone a lot more than I thought I would. The benefit of having this monstrous battery is something I definitely underestimated when I first picked this device up. And furthermore, I was also pleasantly surprised by having a pretty clever, overall very rugged feeling design that feels stable, well put together, along with actually a very good display. That HD Plus resolution that gets close to being Quad HD with sharp and vivid colors, in addition to having lots of little details that actually make a lot of sense, like a built-in eye protection mode, such as having a great multitasking drawer built right onto the bottom here, all enhances the overall usability of this otherwise mid-tier handset. And so the last thing that you really have to consider, I would say, is whether it's worth it for you. The price point of this phone isn't exactly cheap compared to other mid-tier offerings with similar processors and SoCs on paper. It retails for about $250 to $280 depending on when it's on sale, and for that price you can also pick up slightly more powerful handsets and maybe by better brand names, perhaps by Honor or Huawei. However, what you'll be missing is that incredible battery life. You'll probably also won't have NFC, and you'll probably end up with a camera that is either as good or maybe even slightly worse than the primary 21 megapixel sensor on here, because I was really impressed with this particular one. So those are all things to consider, and I would say that having this giant battery in some cases is even more important than having the fastest processor in the world, just because everything that you really would want to do, including running tons of games and apps, especially with 6 gigs of RAM, you can tell how fluid and silky smooth it still is able to handle all these things, still is basically enough for the average consumer. And being able to use this phone for an entire week before you need to recharge it really is a huge convenience. So this has been the K10. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews.